Hey everybody, Pete here with the River Kings. So I put a recent question out to you guys, what do you want to see in upcoming videos? And I kind of posed it as more camping, more kayaking, and the overwhelming response that I got was both. Specifically, the number one request was how to choose a campsite when kayak camping. So I figured, hey, that's a good one. Let's do that today. Now, if you look around on YouTube and some other places, everyone likes to have acronyms, cool little catchy things they say, like the 4 W's of camping, the 5 W's of camping. Today, I'm going to give you the 36 W's of kayak camping campsite selections. No, I'm not really going to do that. The 4 main ones you get are wood, and in some order: wood, water, weather, wind, waste, wildlife. That's 6. But for me, the number one selection criteria is how easy is it to get my kayak out of the water, and then how close can I camp to the kayak? Because I'm lazy. My preferred medium for substrate in the campsite area would be small pebbles up to the size of silver dollars and maybe 3/8 inch in thickness, and that's happened a couple times. Sometimes the rocks are bigger, sometimes they're smaller. And the number 2 material for a camp floor and landing area is sand, and the reason it's not number 1 is it gets all in your boat, in your shoes, in your gear as you're packing, unpacking, and you can take steps to mitigate that and keep it to a minimum, but with the pebbles it's much cleaner, much better. Well, aside from Brian and I's cave campsite, which was unique in so many ways and kind of special, probably the best campsite we've ever had was on the Greenbrier trip just below Ronceverte, and it was the perfect campsite for my number 1 criteria. You landed just a very low slope angle of the beach, perfect sized rocks, and then perfect trees to spread out and camp with. Another thing to think about is how bushy is the area. I could get up on top of that and I could make a campsite, and that might be ideal for some situations where I'm trying to stay stealthy, but you're just going to be in the weeds, in the bushes, easy to lose gear. If you're prone to catching poison ivy, that's a good place to find some. There'll be little ticks and chiggers will be more in those areas. So if I can find like an open spot like this, I mean, that's what we're looking for. That tree, the 2 trees nearest my kayak, I can hang my hammock between that. I'm 4 feet from the kayak. I can pull my kayak up under the tarp if I want to, and that way if it's raining in the morning I can pack up and dress and whatnot under the tarp, and that works pretty good. Some things to think about if you're in an area where you might receive a dam release or a heavy rainfall somewhere upstream. The water levels can rise significantly on rivers, so I know this area, I know this particular river very well, and I know what kind of rain it takes to make this river go up and down, and I would have no hesitation camping here tonight. But there are days when camping here wouldn't be ideal. Perhaps I would pull out here and then start heading up to the high ground where I know that, you know, my kayak's not going to float away. I'm not going to be swinging in water in the morning. Alright, so now that you found your little beach, and that's all it takes, just a little beach, a little pebble beach, a little hole in the swamp, just something where you can get your kayak out of the water on some stable ground. And then you got to look up. That's what I do, safety. Look up, make sure there's no dead trees, make sure there are no dead limbs, make sure there's nothing hanging in a tree like a dead limb just precariously hanging over your campsite. And that's what they would call widowmakers, which is one of the W's. And you don't want that to fall on your head. Another thing is wood. If you're going to have a campfire, wood is kind of a thing that makes campfires a lot easier. If I camped right here there's not a lot of firewood. The thing about firewood is if you camp in a backcountry setting, dispersed camping, that means you're not coming to an established campsite where tons of people camp already, then you'll have firewood everywhere. And in this situation, if I look across the river, there's more firewood that I could burn in 3 weeks of camping right here. And it's warm, I could just wade, go get the wood, bring it back if I wanted to fire. That would be no issue at all. All right, another W is security. The W is silent in that one. All right, so a lot of people have a security issue in mind a lot of times, and from my background and the way I think about it, the more secluded and the more hidden I am from the rest of the world, the more secure I am, because no one's going to find me. If I were to take my kayak up on this hill, go back just over the crest, no fire, hang my hammock low, pull my kayak up in there, you're not going to find me, you're not going to know I'm there, and I'll just, you know, do my thing, and when nightfall comes, I'll go to sleep, wake up, no headlamps, you know, no string lights on my hammock if I'm worried about that kind of thing. And I'm wanting to stealth camp. You cannot have lights, you cannot have fires, you cannot have sound if you're actually stealth camping. Now, a lot of people like to say stealth camping, but they do a big fire, they hang lights, or they have lanterns, or they're doing headlamps, and they're playing guitars, or, you know, singing or laughing. That's not stealth camping. That's camping out of sight from where people probably would be, but you're going to draw them in with all your racket. So if you're looking for security, say this is a river that gets a lot of action during the day with people traversing the river. I like to get in these little side cuts. Now this is an island here, and this is a dead water channel, and at high water this flows around the island, but at low water it's just standing still. So I paddled up in here about 1/4 of a mile. That right there is going to take me out of being seen by probably 95% of the people that come down this river. And so if you don't want to be messed with by people, just go up a little side creek, do that sort of thing. It's important to note there are trespass laws in place in every state, and if you're outside the United States, I'm sure y'all have y'all's laws too. Here in North Carolina, bigger islands like this will oftentimes actually be owned. Small islands that form out in the river, usually that's part of the river. Now, I am below the high water mark. Now, that doesn't mean when the flood was here and it was 32 feet, well, that whole field was underwater. I can't count that. But the high water mark is the legal term for what is the riverbed. This little sandy beach is below the high water mark. So I'm good to camp here as far as legal permission trespass laws are concerned. That may not be the case in your state. I'm not trying to tell you to go out and get in trouble, and I'm not trying to tell you to go trespass. But if you find yourself in a situation like I have before, when things go wrong, or you have overshot or undershot your target area for camping, where you know you'd have a good spot, and you have to make something work, you cannot get a hold of the landowner because you don't know where he is, you don't have cell service, etc., etc. You got to camp somewhere. Maybe that's the time to go slip back and just stealth camp. If you're going to do that, of course, leave no trace is what we practice here at the River Kings, because that's just good business. We will leave the campsite we land in better than we found it. And if we have to walk around for a little while to find a piece of trash, pick it up, we'll do that. We don't chop any trees down. We don't cut anything down. That's just good business. It's taking care of the resource of wilderness that we have around us, and that's what everyone out there should be doing. One of the 5 W's is water, and this is water that you're going to be cooking with and drinking, cleaning, whatever you got to do. And this is actually not the best site for that, because this is a dead water pool. There's no flow to it to speak of. There's a little bit of water coming through here, but if I was going to be gathering water from any kind of water source, I like to have as much flow as possible. And this particular river would not be something I would use a steri pin in. We're again moving into the MSR Guardian or other filter as such that would also take out chemicals and mineral contaminants, as well as your living organisms that are going to give you a lot of trouble. But if you're on a river where you're getting your water, just think, can I get water as close to the campsite as possible? You know, on these beautiful rivers that we do up in the mountains, most of them we can just pull water right out of the river. If they're getting a little big or a little murky, we'll get the water from feeder streams that are coming right off the mountain faces and dropping into the river. And usually that's crystal clear and ice cold. Like Paint Creek on the French Broad, it was just a good stop to get some water. Okay, so you got wildlife. I live here in North Carolina, and the only real concern that I have ever faced from wildlife was a gator slide that I was forced to camp on down near Wilmington on my Source to Sea trip down the Cape Fear. And I started that here in town. In 241 miles I landed at the beach, and my last night I got stuck in a salt marsh as the tide was going down and was forced to camp on a small island. The only way to access the island through all the cane and reed was to take a gator trail up a gator slide onto the island. And I didn't want to hang my hammock in food bag height, because while I've never heard of a gator taking a hammock camper, I didn't want anyone else to hear about that and me be involved as well. So I hung my hammock about 12 feet up in a kind of a Swiss Family Robinson tree, and it was actually one of the highlights of the trip. If you're in an area with bears, you might consider hanging your food in a bear bag. If you're in an area with a lot of raccoons, mostly established campsite raccoons are a little braver. They'll come in your tent, take your donuts. Isn't that right, Josh? I have been up to Alaska many times, and that's a different place, and they have some different animals up there that force you to think about things in a little bit different way. And we would take our food 100 yards downwind of camp in one direction, and on my big hunts the meat would be separated but also at least 100 yards downwind in another direction, and we would put noisemakers around the different piles, one being the meat, one being the food, so that if a grizzly got into the food or the meat during the night, we would know which one to address to try to kind of scare him off, protect our stuff. But that's Alaska. If you're not, you know, if you're in Africa, if you're in Alaska, if you're in an area with a problem bear, if you're in an area that actually has something that's really going to give you trouble, definitely take wildlife precautions. Here in North Carolina, it's really not an issue. There's been a few times on a trip or two of ours where the most absolute perfect campsite was up a bank about as steep as the other side of this river here, and what we had to do is put ropes on the kayaks and just do a 2, 3, 4-man team to get the loaded kayaks up onto the plateau where the camping was phenomenal. Once you're up there, it's actually pretty nice, and we've had a really gorgeous campsite or two having to do that, and you can get a little bit out of sight and out of mind from folks. Alright, now how do you find a spot like this? That's the important thing, because we all know there's spots out there, and normally if you're like the River Kings, we'll find our perfect spots at about 3 p.m. when we still have, you know, 10-15 miles left to cover in a day. And we'll pass it and we'll all look at it. No one's going to look at each other and say anything because we're all thinking the same thing. Boy, that would be a really nice campsite. Yet we all know we have to go much further down the river to get where we're going. So how do you find a spot like this? And that might be the most important thing. Well, you got to get lucky sometimes. And you can do a lot of homework and you can give yourself every advantage to try to find a place. But if you're in an unfamiliar river or an unfamiliar area, sometimes what you think is going to work out won't, and sometimes the river will surprise you with a gift. Now, this is a little side chute around an island, and usually the back sides of islands where the silt kind of washes away is a much lower slope than the front side. And there have been some mountain rivers where that is 100% opposite. We saw a few on the New River, we saw a few on the French Broad, and you know, there's been a few in some other areas as well. But a lot of times the back side of the islands will be tapered off. Sometimes there's not a lot of trees there, but at least there's access to the land. On the river banks, if the river is straight and has no turns happening, likely there's not going to be a good place to beach. But when the river starts turning left and right, the inside bank is where all the silt and small rocks and pebbles, that's where all that deposits during high water events. So if you're banking on finding a campsite on a riverbank, look for the sharp turns, like hard banks, 90-degree angles or more, where that river winds back around, and on the inside edge there, 9 times out of 10, there's going to be something a little better than everywhere else. And just every now and then, you'll find the perfect spot there. The outside banks are almost never the correct choice. They're getting scoured in high water, so that cuts the bank vertically, and that's the same as your straightaways. So straightaways, outside bends, wherever there's current, that's not going to be, by and large, where you're going to find your best camping spots. What we do is, in planning, we usually have a stretch of river we're trying to cover in a certain amount of days, and that pretty much drives how many miles of kayaking we're going to get done in a day. And normally we are doing about 25 or so, more or less, miles in a day. And I'll give our crew a 5-mile camping buffer, most likely. And what I'll do is I'll look at topo maps and find areas where there's no development, there's no houses, there's no roads, there's nothing that's going to give us trouble running into conflict with landowners, nothing like that. And somewhere in that 5-mile buffer, we will try to pick a campsite. And normally we can do those 5 miles in an hour and 15 minutes. So at the end of the day, we have an hour and 15 minutes to start looking for a site and pick something within that time frame. And if it's the first 10 minutes of that 5-mile buffer, or that hour that we want to pick a campsite in, we'll take it. If it's getting towards the end and we're getting desperate, sometimes we've had to make things happen. Another thing you need to do, and it's a little more advanced, is start studying the rivers you're on as you're going down the rivers and logging when you see a viable campsite. And I will normally look at my mile marker and say if it's mile 5, mile 5. And then when I see another one, I'll look down again. Oh, maybe it's mile 5.5. And when I see another one, I'll look down. Okay, now it's mile 7. And so what I'm doing is figuring out how often on this river there is a campsite that would work for us. That way we'll have some kind of reference, because while there are some drastic changes that can occur very quickly in rivers, most of the time a river will follow character, and with a very slow gradual change as it comes out of the mountains, gets slower, gets into the lowlands and on towards the coast. But when you're in an area, you can kind of pick up the character of the river and know to at least some degree what it might be offering you later in the day. And by logging the times/mile markers we're passing these campsites, it's giving me some kind of level of prediction of what I might find later in the day. If I'm only seeing a campsite every 10 or 15 miles, that's going to change how we address looking for a campsite in the evening. When we get into our little time period or a mile marker period where we need to find a campsite within this window, we may take something a little less perfect because we know there hasn't been a lot during the day. On some trips, most notably our new river expedition, the second portion of that trip, we picked up 4 more paddlers and gave our group a total of 9. So trying to find a place below the high water mark with adequate camping for 9 individuals is much more of a task than to do it for 1 or 2, as you might imagine. So depending on the size of your group and the area you're paddling in, staying in a sanctioned campsite might be viable due to the impossibility of finding a site big enough for everyone to camp in without negatively impacting the area. If you have to start clearing trees and whacking with the machete and chopping things to try to make a spot for everybody, that's really kind of missing the point of why we're going out there, and you're kind of starting to destroy nature for everyone else that comes behind you. So if you're going to make a negative impact through the size of your group, that would be the time when you start needing to look at staying at an outfitter or a campground or something of that nature. Well, that's pretty much what I'm thinking about when I'm looking for a campsite, and there's no hard and fast rules that make this a a victory every time. It's just having a whole broad base of criteria you're looking for and ways to try to establish if you can find them and when you should start looking for them, that make it more or less fun depending on how the outcome goes. I would not be afraid of finding a campsite on any river I've ever paddled. That's never been an issue. I've always found somewhere to camp. There's always something you can do. When you get into what I call an emergency, which really isn't an emergency, it's just forcing yourself to do something that is not as agreeable with your preferences. So that's not really an emergency. You just didn't get what you want. When it gets down to that point, there's always been something that I've been able to take in camp. And being in a hammock, that makes it a lot easier for me. All I need is 2 trees. That's all I need, just 2 trees and somewhere for the boat to be till I wake up in the morning. Alright, so that's what I'm thinking about when I'm looking for a campsite. And hopefully some of the things I shared with you today will help you next time you're planning an adventure, or next time you find yourself out on the water looking for a place to call home for a night. They're good ones, they're bad ones, and some of my worst ones are some of my best memories. So don't let the fear of not finding the perfect campsite stop you from going out there and enjoying an overnighter on a river. There's always something. Onward.